Hello, everybody. Welcome, and thank you all for coming for the third lecture of our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. I am Professor Daniel Simão Nascimento, the organizer of the symposium and the host for this meeting. Unfortunately, there is some background construction being done near my house, so I apologize for any background noise. As usual, I'd like to thank FAPERJ and CAPES for their financial support, and the members of the research groups Pragma and Polyphonia for their academic support. Today, we're joined by Professor Joseph Karbowski, who is delivering our lecture, and by our three usual suspects by now, Professor Lucas Angioni from Unicamp, Breno Zoppolini from Unifesp, and Roberto Gracio. But today we will also be joined by Professor Mariska Leonissen from the University of North Carolina. As some of you may be aware, Professor Leonissen is only scheduled to deliver her conference or symposium on the 30th of June, but she has very graciously accepted my invitation to be here with us today. So let me briefly thank them all for joining us today. And without any more delay, welcome Professor Karbowski for our Symposium of Aristotelian Studies. Joseph, the floor is yours.
All right. Thank you, Daniel. So let me get this set up so you don't have to look at my ugly mug. Okay. I'll start. The title of today's talk is Aristotle on Animal Thought, and you're going to hear a caveat about the word thought in a few moments. But before I begin, I wanted to make sure I get my thank yous out now because a couple times I've given talks where I never got to the end and I never got to thank the relevant people. So I want to make sure I do the thank yous first so that, because to me that's very important. So I want to thank the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation for supporting my research. I've been on research fellowship since January 2020. In fact, through the whole duration of the pandemic, and they've been wonderful and supported me even in these difficult times. And also thank you to Christoph Rapp, who's my sponsor for that. I also want to make sure I thank Daniel for setting everything up here and for inviting me and for inviting all of you to this discussion. And last but not least, of course, I want to thank all of you who have taken the time to come here and to listen to this talk and to give me some very insightful comments, criticisms, feedback, no doubt. So without further ado, why don't we start? All right, introduction. So Aristotle, it's pretty well known that he believes that human beings are special among sublunary creatures. And their specialness, if that's a word, their special status is manifested in a number of ways. And so I'm going to start off with just a couple of passages that I presume are very well known, but it doesn't hurt to just have them quickly in front of our faces to remind ourselves. So here's a passage where he basically says that the species other than humans, they're capable of living better or worse lives relative to the standards of their kind. But humans alone possess happiness or are capable of achieving happiness, eudaimonia. No horse or bird or fish or any other being is happy, but they can live better or worse. Another special trait that they exhibit, well, it's a little complicated, but another passage in which he draws out one way in which human beings are special is the way in which they exhibit politicality. A human being is more political. There's some issues about translation, whether they say rather or more. I prefer the more political for reasons that I can elaborate later if you need to, even though the talk isn't directly on this, than any bee or any other gregarious animal. And it turns out the reason why he says this is because we're alone capable of speech. I think that's the best translation of logos there, which is for making clear what's beneficial and harmful. It's peculiar to humans that they alone have perception of good and bad, just and unjust, and the rest. And participation in these makes a household and a polis. So there's something about their nature which you get a kind of a hint about here, where he calls it perception of good and bad, just and unjust. But many people have pointed out it's not just basic, typical perception like looking at a tree. It's a special kind of rational perception. Maybe he even means reason, rationality here. But in any case, there's something special about human cognitive capacities that underwrites their special politicality, why they're more political than any of these other gregarious species. So, yeah, there are also passages where he highlights the special cognitive features, intellectual features of human beings. In this passage from the De Anima, he says, in the other animals, there is neither thinking nor reasoning. He denies them noesis and logismos. And this is a passage that I'll actually return to because it's very important for what I'm going to be arguing. Another passage earlier in the De Anima, every belief doxa implies conviction, conviction implies being persuaded, and persuasion implies logos. Some beasts have fantasia, but none logos. So there, in this one passage, he denies them a whole host of interconnected cognitive or intellectual states and abilities. Belief, conviction, persuasion, logos. And it's interesting because they're all kind of funnels back to logos. And I have a take on this that I will dogmatically state later on in the talk as a way of illustrating some of the context of what I'm arguing for and how it ties to deeper points. And then lastly, for movement belongs to the other animals, but thought, Dianoya, belongs to none. And so, there's a host of robust cognitive vocabulary here. Noesis, logismos, Dianoya, logos. And one of the main things that I'm going to be arguing for is a bit of a muddying of the waters here and pointing out that the picture is more complicated. But these are well-known, robust cognitive terms that Aristotle tends to use. And when you first read these passages, and especially reading them with the backdrop of the politicality remarks and the eudaimonia remarks, it makes it look as though Aristotle is kind of quasi-Davidsonian. And here's a famous remark by Donald Davidson from his paper Rational Animals. A creature cannot have a thought unless it has a language. In order to be a thinking, rational creature, the creature must be able to express many thoughts and, above all, be able to interpret the speech and thoughts of others. Now, when I call Aristotle Davidsonian or raise the question of whether he is and to the extent to which he is, obviously I'm not trying to commit Aristotle to the whole package of Davidsonian views and how thought relates to language and so on and so forth. But there is, you can read the passages that I just briefly went over and think that Aristotle and Davidson are barking up the same tree insofar as they both want to deny non-human animals rationality and the capacity for thought. Now, neither Davidson nor Aristotle, as is well known, wants to deny that they can do a lot of cool, very complex things with their behavior. But what Davidson and it looks like prima facie from these various passages that I was looking at, they both want to deny they can do a lot of cool things, but they can't think. They don't exhibit rationality. And that's one way of reading these passages. And a lot of people think that Aristotle holds some version of this view, where he categorically denies reason and thought. And earlier I had a passage from Hendrik Lorenz's book where he says this, and he thinks Aristotle holds a very strong line about denying both reason and thought to non-human animals. And here's what I want to say. It's a brief introduction to my take on all of this. So I think it's definitely indisputable that Aristotle thinks humans are special among sublunary creatures. And it's indisputable that he believes that a specific kind of thought is beyond the scope of non-human animals. Nonetheless, what I want to argue is that Aristotle ascribes to animals a kind of thought that's non-rational. And I have in parentheses Noose and Dianoya. Now, whenever I say that Aristotle endorses a kind of animal thought, I'm using the term thought here for simplicity and convenience. What I do not want is, I don't want the discussion to devolve into a debate about the English word thought. What counts as thought? I mean, there's interesting philosophical issues there, but in a way that can quickly get off topic and turn into things that quickly have very little relation to Aristotle, or at least tend to be anachronistic. So the heart of my thesis is that not only does Aristotle ascribe to animals a kind of cognition, namely fantasia, which everyone acknowledges, everyone knows that he ascribes to them a kind of cognition, and they're not just like furry machines, like Descartes seemed to think. That they are capable of a kind of cognition which primarily, or at least at the highest form, takes the form of fantasia. But this is what I want to claim. He views some instances of their episodes of fantasia as expressions of Noose and Dianoya, and ascribing them a kind of Noose and Dianoya is not incompatible with his denials of Dianoya, Noose, etc. in the Davidsonian passages. So you'll see how I kind of want to tease a couple strands apart, and how I want to make sense of his denials of Oasis, Logismos, and so on and so forth, consistently with his ascriptions of another kind, I don't want to say another kind, but a kind of Noose and Dianoya. That's part of what I'm going to try to do in this talk. And to help fill out the picture towards the end, I'm going to make some just assertions and address some objections, which help fill out the picture. And even though I'm not going to argue for those claims, it'll kind of give you a picture of where I'm going and what my view is, what my broader view is. Okay, so now in this second section of the talk, I'm going to have us quickly look and briefly look at some very well-known passages about animal phronesis. Now, I'm going to let you know, I want to make it clear that these aren't actually the most important for my argument. People nowadays, primarily thanks to Jean-Louis Le Barrier's work, are very well aware of these passages. Even people that think Aristotle is a Davidsonian are very well aware of these passages about phronesis. So it's not as though I'm not using them as primary evidential support for my thesis about animal Noose and Dianoya. The purpose of going through these passages is because I think Aristotle's view about phronesis provides a helpful model for how he thinks about Noose and Dianoya. And so it'll give you a way, it prevents a kind of framework for making sense of the more important passages that I want to make sense of, which I'll introduce in the next section. Okay, so here's a passage where he talks about deer being phronimon, or appearing to be phronimon. Among animals that are wild and quadruped, the deer not least seems to be phronimon, because it gives birth alongside roads, for wild beasts do not approach because of humans, and after giving birth, first eats the membrane. Also, they run for the sessile and eat it before going back to their young. Giving a very general summary, there's a kind of practical intelligence that Aristotle is ascribing to deer here, that is manifested in some of their behavior with respect to giving birth. They give birth alongside roads, and that's pretty smart because, he indicates, wild beasts don't approach. It's safer for them. And they tend to know how to heal themselves after. After giving birth, it eats the membrane, which helps it heal more quickly. And there are a ton of passages like this in the history of animals. Here's my favorite, actually, cuckoo phronesis. The cuckoo is phronemon and how it manages its reproduction. Owing to the fact that it has full knowledge, sunedonai, of its own cowardice and inability to help its young. For this reason, it makes its own chicks, as it were, supposititious in order to save them. It gets another bird to essentially do all the rearing for it. For this bird is exceptionally cowardly. It has its feathers plucked by the little birds and runs away. So what he seems to be suggesting here is he, in no uncertain terms, he ascribes the cuckoo an interesting kind of self-knowledge, a self-knowledge of its own cowardice. This is, by the way, a cool passage because he ascribes phronesis to it, or at least calls it phronemon, while simultaneously calling it cowardice, or cowardly. And so you have the ascription of phronesis tied together with a kind of vice or a vicious, certainly not virtuous state. And so the story he tells about the cuckoo is because it's aware of its cowardice, that it's essentially going to bolt at the first sign of danger. It realizes, hey, it's not going to be the best one to rear these kids because it's going to leave anytime there's a sign of danger. So it tricks other birds into raising them. And that's kind of intelligent. Yeah, I really find this interesting, and there's really a lot here to unpack, and so I'd be happy to talk more about it if you want to, but not a lot of people actually mention this passage whenever they talk about phronesis. They usually use the deer and some other ones, but I thought it's good to bring this out to you for the reasons that I mentioned about. You get an ascription of kind of self-knowledge to the cuckoo, and then you have phronesis being ascribed together with a kind of vice, or at least less than virtuous condition. Okay, and so here's a more general passage. Before we looked at passages where he ascribes a kind of phronesis or practical intelligence to specific animal species, here's one of his more general programmatic methodological remarks about all of this stuff. There are in many animals cultivation and wildness, gentleness and harsh temperament, courage and cowardice, and many likenesses of comprehension, sunesis, with respect to thought. Some of these traits differ relative to humans by the more and the less, while others differ by means of analogy. Just as there is craft, wisdom, and comprehension in humans, so too in some animals, there is some other natural capacity of this sort. And there's questions about how to read this last passage, the passage that I haven't read, the second part. Just as there is craft, wisdom, and comprehension, so too in some animals, there is some other natural capacity of this sort. Some people like Jim Lennox and Labarriere believe that Aristotle's leaving the relation between techne, Sophia, and comprehension and their intellectual counterpart in animals open. He's just saying, oh, there's some kind of similarity relation, and we'll figure out later what it is. But other people, and I tend to be among this group. I think he is not just saying that they're similar in some way, but I do think here he's expressing a kind of analogy. Just as there is a form of craft, wisdom, and comprehension in humans, so too there's an analogous intellectual state. That is to say, some kind of intellectual state that is similar to techne, Sophia, sunesis, analogically. And this turns out to be the state that he uses a lot of different vocabulary. If you read History of Animals, phronesis, phronimos tends to be the most common adjective, but you even find a form of noose once in a while, technikos, and some other intellectual terms to denote the intellectual, practical intelligence of non-human animals. Now, here's a passage in the Nikeckean Ethics, which I think is very important for making sense of all of this. Now, I admit that it's a bit of a leap. All the other passages we were looking at were within the biological works, and here I'm turning to a passage from the ethical treatises, which has its own goals, objectives, and so on. Nonetheless, I think that it's consistent, not only consistent with what he says about animal phronesis in the biological works, but it provides a helpful framework for thinking about how non-human animal phronesis relates to human phronesis. So what he says here is that which considers well the matters that concern it is phronemon. That's a general description of what it is for something to be phronemon, is to be capable of considering well the matters that concern it in its life. That is why, in fact, we say that some beasts are phronema. However, many of them evidently possess the capacity for forethought about their lives. So if you go back and you read these passages about the deer and the cuckoo and so on, this makes perfect sense. He gives a lot more details, and their forethought tends to be divided into certain different facets of life. So, and if you read all of these passages and summarize them and look at them, yeah, some animals exhibit phronesis with respect to how they go out and they get food. Not all animals with phronesis exhibit this phronesis in this dimension of life. Some of them, like the deer, do it with respect to reproduction, and so on and so forth. There are different facets of life that non-human animals can exhibit this practical intelligence with respect to. Nonetheless, what they all seem to have in common, and why he seems to be willing to ascribe them a kind of phronesis, is because they exhibit a kind of forethought about their lives, about some dimension of their lives. Now, interestingly, human phronesis meets this description as well. If you look at the account of phronesis in 6.5, which is what everyone gravitates to whenever they think of phronesis, phronesis is, a state with a true logos involving what's good and bad for human beings. It's a capacity for forethought about what's good and bad for human beings. I think it very much meets this general description of phronesis as well. So I'll hum a few more bars in a second, but let me just start drawing some lessons. So Aristotle seems to operate here. We get this from the passage in Nikeckean Ethics, book 6.7, with a general conception of phronesis, and a specific conception restricted to certain animal species. So what I'm calling general phronesis is the general ability to, quote unquote, consider well crucial matters pertaining to survival and flourishing in one's environment. What I think he's providing here is a general description of phronesis. And I realize a general description of phronesis isn't necessarily the same as a description of a general conception of phronesis, but I think that that's his view as well. So you get there's a general state, intellectual condition, that involves being able to consider crucial matters pertaining to survival and flourishing. But in the other passages, you get narrower forms of phronesis that are determinate states or abilities which enable specific animal species to fulfill their needs and navigate their environments well. They are tailored to specific ways of life. So in other words, there is a specific determinate form of this general phronesis that deer exhibit. There's a specific determinate form of this general conception or type of phronesis that the cuckoo exhibits. And by the way, there's also a specific determinate form of this general brand of phronesis that human beings exhibit. So you have a general determinable state, and then you have different determinations that are tailored to different individual ways of life of different zoological species. So you have both general and specific, as I'm calling it, forms of phronesis, although I do think probably the best way to make sense of it is by the framework of determinable determinate. But in any case, even though I think there's a distinction between general and specific phronesis, I want to emphasize that I don't think general phronesis, it's not a simple genus. I think that the narrow forms of phronesis exhibit certain similarity analogy relations, and this is where I'm picking up from the history of animals passages. So it's not simply that, oh, okay, there's this general kind of intellectual state, phronesis, and all of the determinate forms of it are on a par. No, 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 no. I think that Aristotle views one special form, namely the form exhibited by humans, as the paradigm. And the others are considered forms of phronesis because they are likenesses. So in other words, you don't just have the general and specific relation. Among the determinate, like the lower ground level relations between deer phronesis and cuckoo phronesis and so on, you get certain likeness relations. At the very least, all the other non-human forms of phronesis are related via analogical similarity to human phronesis. That's what he was getting at the HA71 passage 3. Sorry, we're here. All of these others forms of phronesis that you find in deer and cuckoo and so on are forms of phronesis because, first and foremost, because they are analogically similar to what we find in human beings. And I realize that if I just had the EN passage and the history of animals passage, you might, that's a bit of overreading, to be honest, but I'm going to lean on some passages in the Dianoya, which I think just hammer this home. And so I realize that I'm not providing all of my arguments here for all of this stuff, but this is just giving a preview of my view. And so one form is the paradigm, the others are the likenesses, and that doesn't preclude you from coming up with a general convenient summary. I think that the general form of phronesis, what I'm calling the general form of phronesis, is an abstraction from these more determinate forms. And so it kind of, even though it's a static picture, it's not like Aristotle has an evolutionary picture where all of this stuff develops. But I think if it happens, I think it helps to think of this in two stages where first, you have the ground level stuff where there's a determinate form of phronesis in deer and cuckoo and in humans. And these other forms are similar to human. Human is the primary and strict form of phronesis, and the others are considered forms of phronesis because they're analogous to this. And once you sort of examine them and look at the way in which they're like, you can come up with a general description, which is what he specifies in this passage. Well, that which considers well the matters that concern it. But this is, on my view, secondary to what's going on at the ground level. Okay, so a helpful model for thinking about Aristotle's view of phronesis is friendship. So it's very well known that Aristotle thinks that there are three forms of friendship. There's the virtue friendships, pleasure friendships, and utility friendships. But the picture, at least in the Nikeckean Ethics, is that there's one primary and chief form, which is the friendship of the good people, of the good amongst the virtuous, and the rest are considered forms of friendship in virtue of a resemblance. Note that this doesn't preclude you from coming up with a general summary of what friendship is. There can be, as it were, a general form of friendship that's posterior to what's going on among these relations. Friendship is a form of mutual well-wishing with respect to something that the parties involved think is good, something like that. Whenever you try and teach this stuff, you're going to need to come up with some general description that kind of captures all of these three forms. But it's important to note that even if you can do that, Aristotle still thinks that's posterior to the relations that are exhibited between the determinate kinds. So it's a kind of paradigmatism, is what I'm going to use as a short summary version for Aristotle's kind of view. I think he has a paradigmatic view. There's a paradigm conception of phronesis. And what I'm going to argue now is thought. And again, I don't mean thought in like Noose, Dianoya. Aristotle's terminology here is a bit fluid, but Noose, Dianoya, these higher intellectual cognitive capacities are exhibit a kind of paradigm conception as well. So here's the punchline. Phronesis should not be identified or conflated with thought. Human phronesis is not the same thing as practical rationality. It is a certain state or condition of human practical reason, namely a virtue of a specific subpart of human reason, namely the calculative, or some people call it practical. Aristotle calls it calculative part. Nonetheless, I believe that, like phronesis, Aristotle thinks that thought has a similar paradigmatic structure. And here I'm going to talk about thought, but clearly there's no counterpart of theoretical thought in non-human animals. The only kind of counterpart that you find in non-human animals is a practical kind. That's why he tends to use phronesis most of the time. There's nothing like geometrical thing. Well, I'm going to talk about a passage where you get some ratios and things, but there's nothing like doing geometrical proofs in non-human animals. There are certain analogical behaviors to productive and practical human thought, but there doesn't seem to be any form of analog of theoretical thought in non-human animals. So whenever I talk about thought here, I'm primarily talking about Aristotle's conception of practical thought, or calculative thought here. So just to give you a bit of a warm-up, there are a number of passages now I'm going back to the history of animals, where he ascribes Dianoya, where this is a kind of thought. It seems to be a kind of thought. At least it doesn't hurt to translate it as a kind of thought. Naturally, you can start to debate what's involved in it. But at the very least, he ascribes a kind of Dianoya to non-human animals. And here what he's doing is he's describing in this passage a number of differentia of different bird species. And it's interesting because he distinguishes these different differentia depending upon whether they're features of their character, ethos, or whether they're features of their Dianoya. And unlike some of these other passages, like in the phronesis passage, he doesn't qualify them by dulce. There's not like they seem to exhibit thought or character. It's, yeah, a crake in respect of its character is pugnacious, and in respect of its thought is resourceful. And I just highlighted here, there's 1, 2, 3, 4 references to thought here, Dianoya, at least Dianoya here in this passage. And so it's interesting because this is a similar kind of distinction between intellectual and character states that you find in the Nikeckean Ethics. Did I put that? No, I guess I didn't add that passage. Now, of course, thought in the case of birds is going to be something very different from thought in the case of humans, as I'm going to argue. Nonetheless, I think is what I'm going to argue is there are certain general similarities and analogies that make sense, like that convince Aristotle that you can call what animals exhibit, non-human animals exhibit, a kind of Dianoya. So it's not as though his ascription of animal thought is entirely disconnected from his ascription to a kind of thought in humans. There is a certain relation here. It's not like it's just a courtesy that has no connection to what's going on in humans. It's a complex view with a number of different moving parts, but there is some systematicity here, I think. It's not just, oh, he happens to be using the same term that he uses elsewhere. And so one of the things that I want to do in the remainder of the talk in the broader project is to illustrate these similarities that unite these ascriptions of Dianoya, and as we'll find out in a couple passages here, Noose, to humans and non-human animals. Okay, here's another very important passage where he ascribes a kind of thought, a very precise form of thought, again, Dianoya, to swallows. And this is the 6th passage on your handout. More especially in the smaller than in the larger animals, one may see the precision of their thought. Tain tes Dianoias akrabeon. A first example being among the birds, the nest building of the swallow. For in the mixing of straw into mud, she keeps the same order. She interweaves mud with the stalks, and if she lacks mud, she moistens herself and rolls her feathers into the dust. Further, she builds the nest just as humans build, putting stiff materials underneath first and making its size commensurate with her own. Now, I could go on for a while about all the neat things in this passage, but as I'm looking at my watch, and so I want to make sure I make it much, get to the end of the talk. So what I'm just going to say here is note the reference to a kind of Dianoya. It's not qualified, and what he ascribes to the swallow here is a really complex kind of behavior. And note there's problem solving involved. So he points out, he could have left this out, but he goes so far as to point out that if she lacks mud, she solves that problem. She realizes, hey, I need some mud somehow, and she moistens herself and rolls her feathers in the dust to create it, and then goes about her work of building the nest, which it turns out it's a pretty precise, more or less, kind of endeavor, is what he's emphasizing here. Okay, so there are passages in the history of animals where he ascribes a kind of Dianoya here, where it's not, I don't think Dianoya here is identical to phronesis, at least whenever I want to unpack all of this stuff. I don't want Dianoya and phronesis to be identical. I want them to be related, but I want thought to be something like, an ability to conduct some form of means, ends, and again, I'm going to use reflection here in some general way. Means, ends, I don't want to say reasoning because I want to leave that term for a very special form of cognition that Aristotle thinks only humans are capable of. But it's a form of means, ends, cognition. And I think we really get that here in a couple passages in a passage from the De Anima and De Motu Animalium, in the De Motu Animalium. And so this is a passage that's super important for me. It comes in 310 of the De Anima, and it's where he's arguing that there are two primary efficient kinetic principles, thought and desire. And here's how he introduces the passage. So most people who work on the stuff about animal phronesis and Dianoya are aware of this remark. It's at any rate clear that these two are movers, either desire or nous, if one should set down fantasia as something like thinking. And people will often look at this passage and they'll note it and they'll say, oh, it's just some kind of a fudge. Note the conditional nature. If one should set down fantasia as something like thinking. Aristotle doesn't think fantasia is a form of thinking. He thinks it's just something like that. But I think that Aristotle's picture is more complicated, and you can't just look at this passage with what I have here in this snippet. This is actually part of a larger argument, and you can kind of get that by looking at the passage, the third part of the passage, which I have as C in brackets. There's a therefore, ara, which tends to signify some kind of argument here. And so I think that you need to read what I have in A together with what comes afterwards to figure out what Aristotle's view is. And I think Aristotle's view here that he's expressing is really neat and really complex, and helps us make sense of simultaneously these Davidsonian passages and these other passages where he seems to be ascribing a kind of phronesis and Dianoya and so on to non-human animals. So let's just look at this passage. So he goes on by saying, "For many people follow fantasiae contrary to their knowledge, and in the other animals there is no thinking, no noesis, no reasoning, but there is fantasia. Therefore, both of these are capable of producing motion in respect of place, thought, and desire." Now, again, I think if you just had A and B together, it would be possible to like dismiss this passage or very much play it down, its importance, and saying it doesn't show he thinks that animals exhibit a kind of nous. He's just saying that what they have, fantasia, is similar to human rational thinking. Well, I think that that's part of what he's saying, but I think he uses that to form a broader conclusion about the nature of nous and its status as a kinetic principle. So whenever you get this conclusion, therefore, both of these are capable of producing motion, I think that in order to make sense of this whole passage as an argument that both nous and desire are kinetic principles, you have to read it as a complex modus ponens. And that helps us make sense of the status of this remark here. He's not just saying, oh, maybe we might, one day we wake up and we're willing to consider fantasy as something like thinking, but we can be more precise, and elsewhere we're going to, strictly speaking, deny it. No. I think the argument is this. This is the best way to make sense of the argument. If it's legitimate to consider fantasia similar to noesis, and here I think noesis is a form of rational thinking, then thought, nous, and desire are productive of motion. I think that that's a general principle. If A, then B. Now, the whole purpose of what I think Aristotle puts in this passage B here is to actually support the antecedent of that conditional. It is legitimate to consider fantasia similar to noesis, to where noesis here is a form of human rational thinking. It's not the same thing. It's not a form of it. It's similar to. Why? Well, because it plays a similar role in human and animal movement. Because many people follow fantasia contrary to their knowledge, and in other animals, they don't have noesis or logismos, but they have fantasia, and that underwrites their ability for locomotion. You can consider it similar to noesis. And because it's legitimate to consider non-human animal fantasia similar to noesis, human rational thought, we can conclude that thought in general, nous, and desire are productive of motion. So it's super important, very crucial for how I read this passage to distinguish nous, so what I'm translating thought here, from noesis, human rational thought. I don't think they're the same. I think a lot of people want to read them as similar. And there is a passage, the next passage I'm going to point to from the De Motu Animalium. Aristotle does use nous as a stand-in for noesis. But here I think he's being very cautious, very careful. In my reading, nous is different from noesis here. Nous is a generic term which encompasses all of the cognitive discriminatory principles of animal movement. It includes noesis, so noesis is a form of nous, the paradigmatic form of nous, and fantasia is a form of nous. So, in other words, I think nous has the same status as orexis does. Here, what I'm translating desire. No one denies that orexis or desire has three different forms. I think nous has the same general status here. And one of its determinate forms is noesis, and that's the paradigmatic form. And what he's doing here is arguing that fantasia is a kind of nous. It's not a kind of noesis. It's similar to noesis, and that's what cements its status as a determinate form of nous. Noesis here in this passage, section B, is linked with logismos. So the way Aristotle's thinking of noesis is it's a kind of logismos. Turns out, in my view, is going to involve some kind of logoi. And Aristotle thinks that that kind of cognition only belongs to humans. Nonetheless, you have another kind of cognition, fantasia, which is similar to noesis. And for that very reason, Aristotle thinks it's warranted to consider it a form of nous. So what I say here in this third bullet point is, noesis' status as a form of nous is assumed, but Aristotle believes he has to argue for fantasia's status as a form of nous by appeal to its similarity to noesis. So you have this general picture where you have, as you have orexis, you have wish, spirit, and appetite. And on the other intellectual side, you have nous. And that has different determinate forms, noesis, fantasy, and perception. But this representation of it doesn't do it justice. What would be better is if I had lines pointing from fantasia to noesis and perception to noesis. Because Aristotle thinks that these two guys, fantasia and turns out perception as well, are forms of nous because they're similar to noesis. They play a similar kind of role in non-human animal movement that noesis plays in human rational action. Now you find a similar move in the De Motu Animalium, and here he adds perception, but since I'm getting a little short on time, I'm not gonna belabor the point. This passage does enough to kind of give you an idea of where I'm going and what my view is of Aristotle. So I think it's a paradigm concept for him. Nous has three forms or species, but it's not a genus. It has a paradigm structure, like I think friendship and phronesis does. There's a primary and chief form, rational thinking, the form of cognition that it takes in humans. And then there's a secondary or derivative forms that merit being considered forms of nous because they're similar to the primary and chief form. So just as, so let me just state before I move on, perception and fantasia derive their statuses as forms of nous from their similarity to the primary and chief case, human rational thinking. So again, this passage of friendship, I reprinted it here because I think it's helpful, just as pleasure and utility-based friendships are considered friendships because they resemble the primary and chief form, virtue friendship. So too, in my view, Aristotle thinks that fantasia and perception are forms of nous. Roughly speaking, means, ends, reflection, because they're similar to the form of human rational practical thinking. Okay, so that's essentially the general view that I'm going to be arguing for now. Now, what I want to do is end by filling out the picture somewhat dogmatically, just to give you a clearer idea of how I think Aristotle thinks that what I'm calling noesis, what he calls noesis in the De Anima passage, differs from fantasia and perception. But nonetheless, how all of this stuff hangs together. So, on my view, I think that it's important to distinguish thought from reason. So, thought where Aristotle, this flags Aristotle's descriptions of Dianoya in the History of Animals passage, and Noose in the De Anima 310 and De Motu passage. I think thought should be distinguished from reason in order to make sense of what's going on here. So thought, as I'm understanding it, is a general ability to cognize the means to desired ends, and this is a general ability that's found throughout the animal kingdom. For example, of course, humans exhibit a determinate form of this general ability, what I'm calling thought here, the ability to cognize means to desired ends, but so do other non-human animals, like the swallow. The swallow's nest-building activity is a kind of cognition of means to desired ends. They desire to make a nest, and they cognize the various means needed to bring that desire to fruition. What I understand by reason and rationality should be distinguished from this. The way I understand reason, at least the way I'm using it, And again, I don't have enough time to point out all the passages, but for example, in the passage, like you might think of any 113 and all the passages in the Nikeckean Ethics, what he's talking about there, to logon ekon, yeah, I think that's reason. And Aristotle doesn't think that non-human animals have that. Reason, to logon ekon, is a specific psychological faculty possessed by humans alone in the sublunary realm and maybe some other superior beings. Aristotle uses, now it can be confusing because Aristotle uses the same terms, Noose, Dianoya, for all of this stuff. So we're doing some kind of clarification, precisification, and so on, but that's necessary to make sense of what's going on in all of these passages, and the context has to be invoked to decide what he's talking about. I've come to these conclusions trying my best to take into account all of these contexts and what he's doing in all of these contexts. And of course, we can disagree and so on, but that's essentially the kind of argument that I'm giving, that I have to give in this, in the broader version of this project. Again, being kind of dogmatic here, I can't appeal to all the passages, but I think that when you roll up your sleeves and you look at all of these passages and you read them in their context where he describes Noose, Dianoya, phronesis, and so on, this is the best story that you can give of them that makes sense of all of that he's doing without, dismissing a large number of passages. Okay, so I think it helps to make a distinction between thought versus reason. Yes, sometimes he refers to reason in terms of Noose, especially in the De Anima. You get the Dianoetic faculty and so on. And then you find him in the History of Animals referring to thought, I believe, with Dianoya, and in the psychological works, referring thought to as a kind of Noose. But there's a distinction here. And the different types of thought, different types of Noose in terms of the general framework that I was introducing here, is there, you can make a distinction between rational thought. There's the rational form that thought takes, that Noose takes, what he refers to as noesis. And this form of thought, it's rational because it presupposes reason. Only rational creatures are capable of what he refers to as noesis and logismos in the De Anima 310 passage. Now, in this very highfalutin kind of thought, sensory representations, perception and fantasia, play a role. Of course, many people will point out, well, look, Aristotle says you can't think without fantasia. No doubt, no doubt. I'm not denying that. Nonetheless, what I think is Aristotle's view is that sensory representations play a role in triggering rational thoughts. They're not its representational vehicles. The representational vehicles, human thought, in other words, is not strictly speaking couched in fantasiae and perceptions. They play a role in generating it, but human thought is couched in logoi. And logoi crudely are sentences in the head. It's like a silent sentence. Go back to Plato's description of thinking, and what is it in the Theaetetus or somewhere, where it's like a silent sentence that you mutter under your breath in your soul. It has a propositional subject-predicate structure. Logoi are representations that have a subject-predicate structure, S is P structure. And of course, you can verbalize them, you can explicitly articulate them, but the way Aristotle tends to think of them is, first and foremost, they're features of thought. They're silent. They're things that we can go on to utter, but they're mental representations. So human rational thought is distinguished by the fact that its representational vehicles are logoi. Non-rational thought doesn't presuppose reason. It's a kind of thought that, by the way, humans can actually exhibit it too. Whenever I say, think of a triangle you're not going to mutter a sentence, a triangle is a three-sided plane figure. You're going to picture one probably. And that act of picturing one can be considered a type of thinking, at least the way we tend to use the word thought. But that's not what he has in mind whenever he's thinking about deliberation, practical deliberation, and so on and so forth. Form of rational thought is a kind of silent muttering of subject-predicate statements, as it were, to put it crudely. Non-rational thought is a matter of crudely picturing stuff to yourself, even perceiving things in a certain context. On the way I want to tell the story, the representational vehicles of non-rational thought are fantasiae and perception. So here's a crude illustration of the distinction. So humans, whenever you're exhibiting a form of rational thinking and you want to think that the cat is on the mat, the way rational thought would do that isn't by picturing a cat on the mat. Maybe some picture, image, fantasia of a cat on the mat will have a role in generating that thought, but the thought itself is a logos to the effect that the cat, the subject, is on the mat, the predicate. That logos is the thought, the cat is on the mat. In the rational case. In the case of a non-rational animal, well, on my telling of the story, Aristotle thinks non-rational animals can think, can have a thought to the effect that a cat is on the mat. The form it would take is not a logos in the soul. Aristotle doesn't think animals have the ability to generate logoi. I think fundamentally for Aristotle, reason is a faculty of logoi. That's what he calls it in the Nikeckean Ethics, to logon ekon. It's the part that has logos, the ability to generate articulate subject-predicate mental representations. Below the moon, only humans can do that. Non-rational animals, though they do, have the capacity to image. They can imagine a cat being on the mat. And that act of picturing a cat being on the mat in a certain context counts as an episode of Noose for Aristotle, on my view. So again, a human will think that a cat is on the mat by muttering a sentence to the effect that the cat is on the mat under their breath, in their soul, as Aristotle would say. A non-human animal or a human, whenever they're exhibiting a mode of non-rational thinking, would think that the cat is on the mat by imagining it. Okay, here's an objection that you might be thinking. Doesn't this view reduce non-rational thought to imagination? Well, my answer is yeah and no. Yes and no. Aristotle's view is psychologically economical insofar as it claims that perceptions and fantasiae are the representational vehicles of non-rational thought. However, Aristotle's view doesn't necessarily reduce non-rational thought to perception or fantasia, nor does it conflate the former with the latter. And the reason is because episodes of non-rational thinking are fantasiae that occur in certain contexts, and they have a certain causal input-output structure. So think about dreams, okay? You can raise the same objection. Wait a second. Doesn't Aristotle's view of dreams reduce them to imagination? Well, they kind of do and it kind of doesn't. It does insofar as dreams are entirely made up of fantasiae. There's no like psychological resources over and above the faculty of fantasia that he needs in order to make sense of dreams. A dream essentially is a fantasia. It's a sensory image, but it's one that occurs in a particular context and results from a specific process. A dream image is different from, a memory, because they have different, again, as I'm putting it crudely, causal and input-output structures. They occur in different contexts and result from different processes. I think the same thing is true of episodes of non-rational thought. It's true that there is nothing psychologically more to them other than perceptions or fantasiae. Nonetheless, episodes of non-rational thought are fantasiae that differ from dreams and memories because they occur in a certain context and have a specific functional structure. And here's a simple example to illustrate this before I start to end. So here's a passage, famous passage from where the so-called practical syllogism, I have to drink, says appetite. Here's drink, says perception, fantasia, or nous, intellect. Here again, he's using nous for human rational thinking. At once he drinks. Well, I think this tells us something about all of these. I mean, he's putting them all of these discriminatory capacities, perception, fantasia, or nous, all play the same role, mediating the relation between a desire and its satisfaction. So all episodes of thought have a distinctive functional input-output structure. They're initiated in response to a practical problem. Go back here. There's an antecedent desire, an appetite. I want to drink. That appetite sets for the animal a certain practical problem. Solve me, satisfy me, okay? That initiates a practical problem-solving process, which subsequently aims to solve the practical problem by discovering a suitable means to the desired goal. Once the animal has that desire, it sets about trying to satisfy it. And it invokes various kinds of representations to do so, if that desire can't immediately be satisfied by objects in its immediate environment. It sets about imagining, trying to remember, and so on and so forth. And that's part of the process of bridging the gap between desire or practical problem and solution, or means. And episodes of animal thought have outputs that are voluntary goal-directed movements, which can be evaluated as correct or not. You can say whether or not that was a correct means, or at least an adequate means to the desired goal. If it satisfies it legitimately, then it is. If it doesn't, it's not. I know once you start to get into the practical action and virtue and so on, there are different layers. But my point is, the outputs can be evaluated as correct or not, depending upon the degree to which they satisfy the desire in question, to which they solve the relevant practical problem. Okay, still you might wonder, why consider this employment of fantasiae thought or thinking? And again, I think that Aristotle's responses are kind of Noose or Dianoya. Well, it's because these practical problem-solving episodes are similar. It's analogous to what goes on in the human case whenever they're trying to deliberate. Humans do it in the form of logoi, which they string together. You know, I have a wish to heal someone, okay? Health is this, that's a logos, and then you incrementally reason back using logos and all the other means at your that are available to a determinate choice, part of which can be expressed by a logos, A for the sake of B. Animals can't do that. They can't string together logoi, so they don't have practical deliberation, they don't have practical calculation, logismos, where it involves stringing together logoi. Nonetheless, they have desires, they can be aware of their desires, they can imagine suitable means, and they can even Aristotle ascribes to them a form of experience, which I would argue involves making certain inferences on the basis of past memories, which, by the way, are sensory representations or fantasiae. So in further developing this project, I would need to introduce the notion of empeiria here and elaborate the form that it takes in animals, because I think that that's some of the most compelling evidence for Aristotle's ascription of animals to a kind of thought, because typically when people think of thought, they think of the notion of inference. And I don't think by the way, I'm not alone in this. Many people think that the notion of inference isn't just restricted to, linguistic representations or logoi. So, in other words, okay, so that's kind of getting off topic here. But in short, I think Aristotle considers these employments of fantasiae and perception as a kind of thought because they play an analogous role in animal life, in the generation of non-human motion that deliberation plays in human life. Okay, so I'm just about done here. But what I want to point out is, Davidson, and even though McDowell and Brandon and these Pittsburgh people have very different views from Davidson in certain respects, they all assume that what counts as thought is just this linguistic stuff. Animals with a language are only capable of thought. But many people, both in the philosophy and cognitive science and psychology programs that are working on non-human animal cognition, they have a more generous view of the notion of thought. So here's a quote by Liz Camp. Unlike Descartes, I don't think we should restrict thought or reason to humans. Many other animals clearly do represent states of affairs in the world and manipulate those representations in systematic ways to produce action. Rather than seeing thought or reason as an all or nothing affair, we should treat it as a matter of degree. But if we do, then we should also acknowledge that thought can be implemented in many formats. This last bit is what is crucial. Thought can be implemented in many formats. And this is what I think Aristotle believes. Thought here, by the way, would be translated Noose or Dianoya in the general sense in Aristotle's framework. It has different representational formats. There's one kind of format that only humans can exhibit, which involves logoi, subject, predicate representations, representations with a kind of linguistic structure. However, there are other kinds of thought that don't take place in sentences in the head, that take place in sensory images, and non-human animals are capable of that mode of thought. So my conclusion is Aristotle is semi-Davidsonian. So I think he anticipates the view expressed by Camp, and by the way, endorsed by many contemporary philosophers and cognitive ethologists, that thought, Noose, Dianoya, and Aristotle jargon, has different representational formats. One highfalutin kind of thought, rational thought, is beyond the scope of non-rational animals. That's the extent to which he is Davidsonian. But another kind of non-rational, wholly imagistic thought is prominently found throughout the animal kingdom. Thank you. Okay. So that's the end of the presentation. Sorry I went a little over, by the way.
No problem at all. Thank you very much, Joe, for your presentation. As usual, now we will open for the questions from the debaters, and then we will move on to the questions from the audience. We'll start with Professor Mariska Leunissen, who has already told us that she has an observation to make.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. This is great. As you know, I'm very sympathetic to this kind of project. I like taking what Aristotle says about animal cognition seriously. I think you're right in wanting to spell out the different kinds of cognition that animals have and not just lump them all together as one big bag of something analogous. One thing, there's two things that sort of worried me in the picture or that confused me a little bit. So one is trying to have this idea of phronesis as a paradigm concept.
Mm-hmm.
Was like a general concept and then species differentiation sort of falling under that. And I think you did touch upon that in the caveat section, but I'm wondering if that picture sort of minimizes what Aristotle has in mind by the analogous. So you're right that they're similar, but the similarities I think preclude them having a kind of genus-species relationship, because the analogous means that they can go in the same box. And so I think one thing that helps, and I think fits your picture nicely, is to just think of these, of phronesis having two boxes that are on the same level. But in the one case, phronesis is completely grounded in, so to speak, in the perceptive soul of animals, where perceptive soul includes perception and fantasia. And in humans, phronesis is grounded in perception plus rational soul. So if you think of these capacities as being produced by the differences in the kind of soul parts that humans and animals have.
Yeah.
I think you can preserve the whole picture that you have, but without trying to have a genus species kind of relationship, because I think the analogous that gets you into trouble there.
So, were you finished? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off if you weren't
No, this
finished.
is I can be finished. So I put a passage in the comments from GA where Aristotle talks about perception as a kind of gnosis, as a kind of cognitive.
Yeah.
And so I think that helps your case. So like I think all we need to see is how perception can do all this really awesome cognitive stuff. And then what you get in humans is the same awesome cognitive stuff plus language, basically.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah, that's great. And so in the chapter where I'm working, I definitely have the GA 123. And I think that's very important because he's actually explaining, like there's some causal explanation there, right? Which gives you extra reason to take the cognition, the stuff in History of Animals seriously.
Right.
And so when you read this together with the HA, there's an explanatory framework. And you don't explain a fact that you think is false, and you don't explain a fact that's poorly described, right? Or that's just, like a courtesy, like courtesy description or something. And so that's definitely, thank you so much for reminding me about that passage. So what I wanted to say, I think you're definitely right to bring in the stuff about soul parts. And so one of the ways in which I think Aristotle's view is cool. And so people who work on animal cognition, they invoke this famous thing called Morgan's canon. And there are a number of different readings of it, many of which are just awful. But what he basically says is that the best, at least my interpretation, which I think is follows other people's, which is the most accurate reading of the remark, says that you basically want to try to make sense of as much cognitive animal behavior using the lower psychological resources. So don't ascribe them thought if you can explain it in terms of imagination, as we would, like these lower cognitive capacities. And I think Aristotle very much does that. But to explain it, you do have to make sense of this notion of a soul part. And so this is why I think the view is consistent with the psychological hierarchy, because he can ascribe a form of whatever, Noose, Dianoya, kind of thought, as I want to call it, consistently with ascribing, denying them reason, because what he's denying them there is a part of soul. And then you have to elaborate what a part of soul is and so on. But in terms of this, the genus species thing, I definitely don't want to say that it's a simple genus species. And so what I did want to say was something like, there is some form of generalizing over these ground level relations. And so I definitely want to champion that the primary stuff, like the most important stuff, is going on at that ground level, the analogous relation between what's going on in humans and these other cases. That's like the primary form of relation, the form of similarity. Nonetheless, it just struck me that in the Nikeckean Ethics 6.7 passage, he comes up with a general description, which seems to meet not only what's going on in humans, but in these other animals. So there seems to be some kind of general description that you can, like a blanket description you can give of all of these. Now, maybe what I should do is just be more careful and say, you can give blanket descriptions of this ground level stuff without there being like a general kind that they all instantiate. Would that help?
Yeah, because I don't think there's two types of phronesis, and though they're very much alike, they're not. They're still different, because one
absolutely,
like phenomenologically, one is going to look different because it has language involved.
Yes, absolutely, and I mean, though, there are passages, like there are some passages where he does seem to compare. So he stresses their similarities, and presents it as though like a difference of degree, to some extent, where he says humans are like more. You get comparative uses of phronesis in certain passages. And I think part of my motivation of saying there is some general form, it's not a genus strictly speaking, and these aren't species, but there's something general going on here as a way of allowing for that. But maybe you don't have to. Maybe just having a general common description that they all meet, and they can meet this more or less precisely or more or less better. Maybe that's enough. What do you think about that?
I'm like, yeah, I think the general description is just like I don't think it actually captures like a species. Like it might just be Aristo's way of talking, like, within the ethics, we're skipping over this analogous bit. But then once you start fleshing it out, I think it's two different capacities that look alike, but only analogously. I don't think they're actually capable of the more and the less.
Yeah. I mean, although just whenever, so I didn't put these passages on there. It would help to just present these and read through these comparative passages, and try to make sense of them.
I think you can make these comparisons because in the human case too, a large part of the capacity is informed by or grounded by the perceptual stuff.
By the perceptual thing, yeah.
In that sense, you can still compare them. I don't think you lose that.
I see. Yeah. I mean, still, so I think, okay, maybe I can articulate, I think, my assumption here, and then you can tell me how I can massage it, is I was assuming that whenever you have analogical relations, they are, strictly speaking, qualitative differences or differences of kind, right? But whenever you have a comparative, A is, it's something is more A than another, the way in which they're A isn't qualitatively distinct, or the way in which you're comparing isn't a qualitative kind difference. There's some kind of continuity there, which it's harder to make sense of. But maybe you can do it in terms of the continuity with a perception and fantasia stuff. Maybe there's just a way of doing it there. So
I'm just taking the HA passage seriously. So even when we get these superficially comparative statements, underlying that isn't similarity that is by analogy rather than more and less.
Yeah.
But
I mean, it's just it like yeah. Well, good. No, this is good. This is good. I mean, I would love it to be like, this is great. I like this suggestion, and I would like it to be this because I think it becomes more similar to friendship, and I want it to be similar to friendship in a way, because I think that's a helpful way of illustrating what's going on here. So good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So moving on now, the next question is from Roberto. Please, Roberto.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Joe, for the very interesting work. And I have a question that has two parts, I think. And the source of my question is Aristotle's method for the differentiation of soul powers or faculties, to use a more traditional word.
Yeah.
And roughly speaking, if I remember it correctly, is from object to activity to power or faculty, right? You identify a certain type of object, then you identify the activity, then you have the parts or powers or faculties, whatever we want to call them. So the first part of the question is about the objects. So my question would be, what is the specific noita object? What are the specific noita objects, noita and not aestheta objects of animal thought or animal nous? In the second part or second question, I don't know, would be about activities. And here I was thinking, you notice that in the case of animal thought, we always have some sort of practical thoughts. And I was wondering, what's the reason behind this limitation? And I was thinking, is there some specific cognitive activity that the animal Noose cannot perform? So these are my questions. One about objects, one about types of cognitive activities.
Oh, thank you very much. Okay, so the question about what are the noeta of animal Noose. So I think we need to be careful here. So I'm happy to answer your question in terms of what are the appropriate objects of animal thought. What is it that they cognize whenever they whenever they engage in episodes of what I'm calling thought, what Aristotle would call Noose, Dianoya, and so on. Now, strictly speaking, I don't think he would call them noeta. I understand why you would do that, because that's terminologically similar to Noose and so on. But I would want to say that the noeta that essentially are the proper objects of Noose in the most robust sense, like human rational thinking, are, things like essences and these things, and that's not the proper objects. Non-human animals can't think about essences as such. The sorts of things that non-human animals can think about that form that constitute objects of the kind of Noose in which they can engage are the same things that can serve as objects of fantasia. They're the same things that they perceptually confront, right? Because fantasia, as Aristotle understands them, they're like perceptual remnants. And so, it gets a little complicated and so on, but at least, if you don't have thought, what you're limited in imagining are things that you can perceive, and then you can kind of course, combine them in weird ways and stuff creatively to have nightmares and stuff like that. I don't, to be honest, I need to go back and look at Aristotle's account of dreams and non-human animals and what he says, what his view is to the extent to which animals can join things together in dreams, but I think that the objects of their thinking are the things that they can perceive. And so, for example, whenever a deer it's hungry or thirsty, it needs a drink. And that desire initiates an episode of practical thinking, where it has to try and discover a suitable means. Now, it might just be as simple as putting its head up and looking around, but if there's no water, say, in sight, it has to start imagining, trying to remember where it last saw water. Whenever you start, if you take very seriously his description of empyrea, this can get really complex as well, where you string together and make inferences, from fantasia, memory, past memories, and so on. So I'm trying to make the view as least mysterious as possible. It's not like in ascribing them Noose, he ascribes non-human animals access to kinds of essences or things. This relates to your second question, I think, because it was. Can you remind me? It was like remind me your second question again. I want to make sure I answered it in your terms.
Yeah, let's say it was about whether there is some specific cognitive operation activity that non-human animals cannot perform.
Oh, the theoretical stuff.
And this is the reason why they cannot access. They don't have the type of Noose that is theoretical Noose.
Thank you. Yeah, it's precisely because paradigmatic theoretical activity is a matter of grasping essences, and they're causal demonstrations, inferring causal relations from them. And animals have no use of that. Really, there's kind of two ways you can look at it. There's the empirical aspect, where whenever you do, or Aristotle was doing his studies, he doesn't see anything even analogous to geometrical proofs in non-human animals. All the kind of, all their behavioral activities seem to be focused on stuff about survival and flourishing in their environment. It has this practical dimension. Rearing their young, acquiring food. They're not thinking about properties of shapes and things like that just for its own damn sake. And so they're not interested in what a triangle is as such, or what this other object that I'm looking at, what a bear is as such, and how all of its features relate together. They're interested in bears insofar as they're predators or prey, and insofar as they engage in them in a kind of practical way. And so I think that Aristotle saw no need to develop some kind of analogous relation between, a form of human theoretical and non-human animal theoretical stuff, because there's no grounding for it in his experience in engagement with them. And I think he's probably right about that. Although then again, what do I know? I mean, maybe there are, and people who actually engage more with animals will come up with something like this. But at least as I read Aristotle in the History of Animals and the biological works, he doesn't seem to highlight any kind of non-practical intellectual activity. And so that's why I didn't develop that strand in the interpretation. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, it does help. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So now our next question is Lucas. Please, Lucas.
Well, thank you, Joe. Thank you, Daniel. My question is related to acribeia.
Okay.
Whatever you prefer to pronounce it. Well, acribeia is mentioned in the swallow example in the Historia Animalium, and I wonder why. In that case, my suggestion is that acribeia has nothing to do with what we would call precision in the sense of, let's say, right representation of things, of course, etc., etc. But what I want to suggest, I wonder if you agree with that, is that acribeia is just, let's just say, to hit the point. You have a scenario which is a problem you have to solve. In this case, you have to build the nest, etc., and have to rear the offspring, etc. And then acribeia is just some sort of exactness in hitting the point. It has nothing to do with degrees of precision or any other way of thinking about it. So that's my question. So it's not very organized, but it's just some thoughts that come to my mind. Is how would you ascribe acribeia to this non-rational thought to animals?
Yeah. Are you finished? Okay, I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah. I think I finished.
Oh, okay. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So in general, I'll say that sure, I'm perfectly fine with your suggestion. I like it. That the way to understand acribeia is something like hitting the mark, hitting the point in your terminology, and I have no issues with that aspect of the question. But whenever you were denying that, I was a bit unclear about what you were denying when you were denying it, that it was a kind of precision. So let me explain to you the elements of the passage that I was focusing on, and that I think he believes warrants ascribing a kind of acribeia to the motion, to the kind of thought. It's there where he's pointing out that whenever the swallow is building its nest, it has to combine sticks and water and earth, to make a kind of mud, and then it uses that mud to combine the sticks together into, a sturdy enough edifice that will hold it and its young. And I thought Aristotle's point there was you can't just randomly throw stuff together. Just like Plato points out in Theaetetus, how there's a certain kind of ratio of water to earth that you need in order to have clay or mud. I forget whether it's mud or clay. Maybe there's an issue there. In any case, you can't just have any amount of earth and any amount of water is not going to suffice. You need a certain amount, at least a certain range of an amount of water and a certain range of an amount of earth to combine them. And you also have to combine them in a certain way. He also points out that the way it makes it, it's commensurate with its body. The way it builds its nest, it's not just like elongated or oblong or whatever. It's kind of, maybe this is overreading, but it's kind of symmetrical, so that it can satisfactorily house it and its young, and it's not going to fall over at the first gust of wind and so on. And so those dimensions of that activity, I think superficially, Aristotle was looking at that and saying, wow, you need a kind of precise thought. There's some kind of precision there. And I see no objection to describe, like summarizing what's going on there as a kind of precise thinking, precise insofar as you got to make sure you get the dimensions just right, or at least within a certain small range of the nest. And you got to make sure you have the amount within a certain specific range, otherwise it's not going to work out. And I think that certainly dovetails with your hitting the mark, where the mark specifies some kind of ratio or whatever. But I also don't find any major objection to using the term precision to describe what's going on here. And that could just be me and my idiosyncratic way, but would you care to specify what you want to deny, or like what you want, what view you want to knock off the table, or what you want to caution against with your question?
My microphone, unmuted now. Okay. What I want to deny is just the idea that we have to hit the mark in a very, very precise way, let's say mathematically measured. So this idea of a specific range, whatever values you take on that range will be good enough to hit the mark. That's enough for me. So, and another thing that came to my mind after I finished is that that was something I have thought before, but I didn't put into my question, was that akribeia is many times associated, even if some scholars sometimes did not notice that, but I think it is associated by Aristotle with minuteness of detail. So many, many details. And sometimes Aristotle says, well, I'm not going to dive into the details, and he says this with I'm not going to akribologeista, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And so that's another thing I would be inclined to deny. So the swallow in building the nest doesn't have to go into very, very specific details, and don't have to be very minute in how this or that should be specifically done. That's in general, that's the thing I want to deny. So the idea is to hit the point, or to hit the mark, but in a very, very let's just say in a very general way, not in a very general way that might turn out to be unsatisfactory. But the idea is, I think, this idea of a range. Suggesting that whatever values you pick up in that range is good enough for your purpose is, I think it's a good suggestion. That's what I have in mind. I don't know if it helps to clarify the point.
I see. Yeah. So you were just denying the aspect of akribeia that sometimes people might be inclined to specify as a matter of detail, that you were kind of putting that off the table. I mean, sure, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think I'm okay with that. I need to think more. I mean, it's a bit tough using these English terms because people might use them subtly differently or whatever. We have to make sure we fasten on we're using the terms in the same way to specify. That's why I think it's more helpful to use the examples, and why I said, okay, this is, what I was talking about in this facet of the example, which I think is more helpful than just saying precision and, so, but yeah, I think insofar as I believe I understand what you're saying, I'm fine with that. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Lucas, for the question. Now, we have a couple of observations from Professor Gilles Pearson. He's following us on YouTube. Some of you may know. He's also scheduled to deliver a lecture on the symposium on the 28th of July, and I would like to thank him for following us. So he has two things he would like to ask you. The first is, what is your evidence for the claim that human rational thought does not require fantasia? That is the first one that he put up there. Yeah, I'm not sure I caught where you said that, but he did. And there is one more, which is about Roberto's question. He was wondering whether Roberto was pointing out that if we say that animals have the capacity for thought, then Aristotle would say they can not only think, but also apprehend objects of thoughts. And that falls out of this capacity activity object link. Would you like me to put the first observation up again?
Actually, let's start with this one, and then we can work our way back, because my answer to the previous one is going to be quicker, because it's a matter of clarifying my view. This one, so isn't Roberto pointing out that if we say they have the capacity of thought, then Aristotle would say that they can not only think, but also apprehend objects of thought. That falls out of his capacity activity object link. Okay, so good, thank you. So there is where I think we need to, again, I'm not being super clear here, and where, say, in a written version of this talk, really it needs to be a book, which is kind of what I'm working on. But, yeah, I would have to talk about this relation between what I think Mariska used the terminology, parts of soul, versus just mere capacities or abilities, okay? And so I think what Roberto is pointing out, this activity object link, that primarily he uses it because he's distinguishing different soul, what I'm calling soul parts, you have the perceptual, the nutritive, perceptual, and the locomotive and the intellectual stuff. At that psychological level of description, I think that distinction applies. But within the part of soul that he calls, say, perceptual, it's really complex. That part of soul has different, again, I'm just using abilities here. I don't see why dunamis wouldn't be a good description of that, where it has the ability to generate fantasia. It has the ability to generate dreams. And what I want to say is, without ascribing to non-human animals an entire extra part of soul, he ascribes them the ability to think, where this ability, in the case of non-human animals, is analogous to their ability to dream. Animals have the ability to dream. That's something that they can do. And that's grounded in a certain implementation of the part of soul that he would call perceptual, which is the one that's responsible for fantasia and all that other stuff. I believe that, you can ask what an object of non-human animal thought is, but I don't think that he's committed to describing it as noeta in the robust sense in which he tends to signify as noeta as essences in like De Anima 3 and so on. In the case of animals, the noeta, insofar as there are noeta of in the case of non-rational thought, are just the same objects as perception and fantasia. So I'd be happy for some follow-up questions from that. But I guess the move that I want to make, to put it succinctly, is that interconnection of object, activity, and stuff is primarily at the level of soul parts. And what I think is going on in the case of animal thought is something lower, to which those interconnections don't necessarily apply. So at the very least, it's no objection to say, well, doesn't Aristotle, this is maybe the thing that I'm guarding against, and maybe both Roberto and Professor Pearson are getting at something different. But the one thing I want to guard against is you can't object to my view on the grounds that it commits Aristotle to giving animals some access to essences, qua noeta. I think I can handle that that's not, he's not committed to that on my view. And so if you have further follow-up questions, I'd be happy to hum a few more bars. But let me get back to the first one. The first question about fantasia and human rational thought. In no way, shape, or form was it my intention to deny that human rational thought does not require fantasia. What I was denying, what I was saying is, if I may bring up the slide real quick. Yeah. Let me go back, and I might have been too quick here.
I'm sorry,
I was feeling.
One second, because when you said it was not my intention to deny that human rational thought does not require fantasia, and what he's actually saying is that you claim that it does not require. So
I was saying. So hold on, let me find the relevant slide here. Where is it? Yeah, here we go. This is the one. The different types of thought. Rational thought. The form of thought that presupposes reason. Sensory representations play a role in the triggering of rational thoughts, but they are not its representational vehicles. I'm pretty sure I made a qualification here where you can point out all these passages where Aristotle says, you know, fantasiae are necessary for thought. You can't think without a fantasia. And so I'm very well aware of those passages, but my point was that whenever we unpack the role that fantasiae play, and here I admit I didn't put any passages, you know, I'm being dogmatic. I also made that very clear here. I didn't provide any evidence for this claim, but for example, I think Klaus Corselius does a good job of discussing the triggering role of fantasia in rational thoughts. My point was to say, yes, Aristotle does believe that fantasiae are necessary for rational thought. However, what I wanted to claim was he doesn't think that fantasia are the representational vehicles of rational thought. Rational thoughts per se are not fantasiae. The rational thoughts are logoi, and the fantasiae play a role in triggering the relevant logoi. And so crudely, it's something like, you know, in order to have a thought of an essence, Aristotle thinks you have to picture something with that essence so that thought can, again, this is super crude, and you know, I haven't fully worked out or understood all the details of passive and active nous and everything. So I admit there's a lot of work to be done here, but the idea is something like the fantasia presents it with something that has the essence, and then the nous, the thought, goes to work and somehow comes up with a logos that expresses the essence. The thought per se is the logos. It's not the fantasia. The fantasia has a role in triggering that logos. And the same thing even in the practical case. Practical deliberation is certainly aided by all kinds of images, but the string of practical deliberation is a string of logoi that seem to have a conditionally necessary relation. You know, given that health is this, the claim health is this is a logos, and then you say this is necessary and this is necessary. Tracing out those relations, you do so in the form of logoi, stuff that you can write down on pen and paper, in the form of subject predicate statements. So I definitely did not want to deny that Aristotle thinks fantasia are necessary for rational thought. Rather, what I was denying was that they're the representational vehicles of human rational thought. That human rational thoughts take the form of fantasia.
Oh, well, I think we'll move on, but just so you know, I think he was not convinced. He actually said what he means to ask you was exactly that. What your evidence for that? And he adds, note that the view of the human rational. Note that the view of the human rational thought does not require fantasy as a representational vehicle is compatible with the claim that they are not simply reducible to the fantasia. Yeah.
So, well, so then that would be based on, there's a lot that goes into that, but it's a combination. So yes, I agree that I didn't present evidence for that, but I also said that I wasn't going to present evidence for that because that in itself is a whole, probably several chapters, or so. And so basically it's just a combination of combining the best as I can, the stuff in the De Anima with Aristotle's remarks about human reason in the Nikeckean Ethics. I mean, the way he describes it is as a faculty of logos. And all of the most important things that matter to the human rational animal, like scientific knowledge, Noose, all that stuff, are states that involve, or definitions, deliberation themselves are things that are couched in the form of logoi. Now, I mean, I'm happy to consider modifying the view to point to the effect that maybe fantasiae are the representational vehicles as well. But in any case, what I think differentiates human rational thought is this logos piece. How we work out the details, I'm certainly amenable to. I haven't worked them all out yet. And so if Professor Pearson has a suggestion for how to incorporate the logos and the fantasia so that it comes out looking different from just the mere fantasia in the animal case, I'm definitely open to that. But at any case, I think what I want to say is the crucial thing for differentiating human rational thought from non-human animal thought is this logos bit, precisely because Aristotle thinks that both humans and non-human animals have fantasia. Now, I know there are some views about the nature of deliberative fantasia, and maybe that's one direction that he's pointing to, but I tend to be convinced that deliberative, of Jessica Moss's view there, they're just sensory fantasia that are used in the process of deliberation. They're not some kind of special something else that's qualitatively different from sensory fantasia. But again, I'd be open to further discussion there.
Okay, thank you for your answer. Now it's Breno, I think, by the order. Yeah, Breno is the last of the debaters to ask questions. Then I'll move on to the questions from the spectators. Breno, please.
I believe that Mariska has a follow-up on this. Okay, all right. I'm going to change the subject a little bit, so that's why I'm asking if you would like to say something on that discussion. So I have a question and a related suggestion on the Dianoya text, Dianoya 310 passage. Mm-hmm. But it's more like a clarification question because it is about your distinction between thought and reason. Mm-hmm. And when you were saying that non-rational animals also engage in a sort of inference, quote unquote. And I would like to understand a little bit better what does that mean? Because, for instance, the motto passage, we could read it either as recognizing in animal a sort of intellectual grasp of transitive relations, even if
Mhm.
that grasp is not expressed in language.
Yeah.
There is a more deflationary reading of the passage in which the passage just articulates or explains the causal mechanism of animal locomotion. So I think that we have two different candidates for what this sort of animal non-rational inference could be.
Yeah.
It could be either that a fantasy triggers another fantasy and so on.
Yeah.
And another thing is the abstract grasp of transitive relations, which is something more demanding and complex. So I'd like to understand a little bit better whether this sort of non-rational animal inference is just a causal mechanism through which a fantasia triggers another fantasia and so on, or whether there is a sort of intellectual grasp of transitive relations. Then I have a brief suggestion on the Anima 310, which is...
Why don't you let me talk about this first,
okay,
and then I'll give you but because otherwise I'm going to forget about all this stuff.
Okay.
Thank you. So I mean, I'm inclined to think that I need to think more specifically about the question about transitive relations. I mean, my first hunch is to say that is a pretty highfalutin kind of cognition that requires, language and so on. And so my initial gut is to say that they can't do that as such. On the other hand, I do agree with you that the De Motu passage, at least if you're talking about the so-called practical syllogism passage, I'm very much on Klaus's. I agree with Klaus that it's all about the causal role and everything. So I should clarify that the reason why I brought that passage up was as a very quick way of explaining the kind of causal, like the context that's distinctive of what I'm calling episodes of animal thought. They start with a desire. I wasn't necessarily invoking it for anything more than that. Now, insofar as this inference stuff is involved, I think that the best evidence for that is, well, again, it's kind of slim, but whenever you unpack Aristotle's account of empeiria in the way that I want to, and make sense of how it's different from the kind of empeiria that he thinks humans are capable of, which involve making like general statements and so on about, well, but in any case, I think it involves making similarity judgments in the form of logoi, statements to the effect that, when this person was ill, this healed them and that and so on. I think that whenever you try to unpack what his view of non-rational experience looks like, that's the best evidence that I would view. That you have to tell a story about what that looks like, and it's there where I would further clarify and illustrate this, what I'm talking about, this notion of inference. But it's something like, and it's not just a purely well, I mean, in a way, it's all causal because they're causes and effects and so on. But there is a kind of reflection, I think, that Aristotle can get away with, where it's not just, oh, the animal sees something and that triggers a memory and kind of automatically, like there's a way in which an animal can see something. It can be stumped, like like the Chrysippus's dog. It can't smell where the animal went. It's sniffs the first one, sniffs the second one, the second road, and at that point, all the sensory data available to it isn't there, and so then it has to call to mind past instances where it was looking for things, and after the sensory representations gave out, it always found what it was looking for on the remaining, and there's a lot of highfalutin imagining going on there that's not simply like automatic. I mean, it's a matter of kind of, again, like reflecting on the cognitions that you have and extrapolating from them. And it's based on, at the foundation of it is certain similarity-based judgments. And so you can say the current situation, I mean, it's essentially a matter of recognizing that the current situation they're in is similar enough to the things that they were in the past, not identical necessarily, but similar enough that a tactic that worked in one of these other cases might work. That's a kind of inference, at least some people want to say. It doesn't require language. It doesn't really require the ability to say, I have been in this situation before. And there are people that cite the ability to make similarity judgments and extrapolate from them as the foundation of a kind of inference. Granted, when you have language in the question, this gets more souped up and highfalutin. But even in the case of non-linguistic creatures, they can make these similarity assessments and use it to guide them in pretty complex, sophisticated ways. And so that's kind of where I would be looking. That's how I would be looking to develop that account of non-rational inference in the case of animals. I'm piggybacking on a bunch of contemporary research, but I think it's a useful way of ironing out some of the details of inklings in Aristotle's story. So I admit it's a kind of reconstruction, but it's, I think, very much in the vein that Aristotle intended.
Yeah, and I have a small suggestion on the Anima 310 that is related to that distinction between thought and reason. And it seems that I really like your reading of the passage, and I think that one advantage that I see in your interpretation is that it sort of accommodates better the other variants of the text as well, not only the printed text in Ross's edition. We have in some manuscripts we don't have u noises, we have just he noises or something like that. So Aristotle was saying that in other animals there is thought, however, not reasoning but fantasia, which is kind of what you would like to. And even and I think that even the printed text can be. And I remember you translate ude in ude logismos as something like nor. So not as there is no thought nor reasoning, but the ude could be epithegetical as well. So it could just be something like i.e. Not logismos. So
I'd be happy with that.
Yeah, in other animals there is no thought, and what I mean by thought is logismos here. So the kind of noesis that I'm denying of animals is noesis understood as logismos, but I recognize a different kind of thought in animals, namely fantasia. I think that's the passage is even more like coherent in this. Yeah. Would you take this ude as epithegetical or something of that sort?
I'm happy to take it as epexegetic. It's important for me because it illustrates the relation between noesis, human rational thinking, and logos. Logos is in logismos. And for me, that's very crucial to Aristotle's understanding of what rationality involves. Again, not denying that fantasia has some role to play, and it's a matter of figuring out in detail how that works. But I think that logos for him, that's the key. That's the most important part of it. And Mariska says, I see. Sorry, those of you that aren't watching this in the in the six of us here on screen don't have access to these private comments. But Mariska made a good question about how if human thinking is exclusively linguistic and animal thinking is on fantasia, I don't know why Aristotle would call them similar by analogy. Well, I mean, I think that's a good point. The only thing I would say is that they can be similar by analogy because they play the same role, in generating animal behavior. They play that mediating term between desire and action that helps an animal identify a suitable means. So I don't want to deny that he plays them, that he thinks that fantasia has a role in human rational thinking, a crucial role. And I'm still trying to learn about what that is. And I think it certainly helps to cement the analogy by the fact that fantasia plays a role. But I think that even if I want to be flat-footed, which I don't necessarily want to be, I'm still thinking through all of this stuff and happy to consider alternatives. But even if I were flat-footed and just said, nope, it's logos is the only thing there, which is wrong. But if I were flat-footed, I still think you can make sense of the analogy, but I agree it would be weaker than adding fantasia into the story.
But Joe, just a quick clarification on that. I think,
sure.
Would you accept that humans also engage in non-rational thinking as well? Because that kind of solves the problem, I think. Yeah, because there are episodes of humans. Yeah.
That's exactly right. So whenever you say think of a triangle and you picture one, you imagine one instead of muttering three-sided plane figure in your head. No one does that. They don't say three-sided plane figure. They just picture a damn triangle, right? That would be an instance there. The actual picture of a triangle is your thought of a triangle. In the other case, I would call that an episode of non-rationally thinking about a triangle. Then whenever you're engaged in a kind of demonstration, proof and so on, where you have the definition, that's a rational thought of a triangle, which Aristotle thinks a picture has a certain role in generating. But again, maybe I'm trying to be it's not like Aristotle has the notion of a representational vehicle. It's something that I'm ascribing to him. And so to try and make sense of this. And so I'm happy to, rethink the terminology that I'm using. But I definitely want to get across the fact that, in all of these passages where he denies non-human animals, these highfalutin cognitive abilities, the reason why they don't have them is primarily because they don't have the ability to string together logoi. That's the key to what distinguishes us from non-human animals. Maybe this capacity for logos, I know some people think it transforms their capacity for fantasia and so on, and I'm fine with that. In which case there would be a kind of fantasia that a rational fantasia that they don't have. I'm fine with that as well. But that would be, as it were, posterior to the fact that they don't have logos. That's like the key for me. The view that I want to develop. Yeah, I mean, I still have a lot to work out, but my first book, it took me 10, 12, 15 years. I've been working on topics related to that, and I had all that time to iron out various details and so on. This I'm still just beginning. I'm basically a baby in this project. And so there's a lot of nuances that need to be worked out and ironed out. And so I'm really, really grateful for all of your comments and criticisms and suggestions, because, this just helps point to strands that I need to further develop and iron out and work through.
So this has been a very rich debate. I know that Joe's a little bit pressed for time. I would ask you, Joe, if you're okay to continue for a few more minutes, or if you have to leave. How are you right now?
I can continue for a little bit more. I'm sure there's a bunch of comments, and I want to make sure I get some more
There are two I would like you to give to you, because I think that they encompass some doubts that are kind of all the way through the chat. I will put them both here at the same time, and then you can answer them, because I think the first one is very direct. It's from Samara Costa, and she says, "Thanks a lot." And she wonders if you can understand fantasia like imagination. That's something that I would like to ask you, which is not only about imagination, but whether or not you think that the content of fantasia is restricted to the things that we perceive through our senses, like so many specialists do, because I think that might be important for your theory. I'm not sure you agree. And there's another question which is through the chat too, which is about the animal's ability to act, and of course the question of determinism came up. So Mariana wonders about the question of determinism, whether or not you think that the animal's behavior is privileged determined. And Jonathan also wondered about that. So I think those two questions encompass a lot of what's going on in the chat right now.
Yeah. Okay, good. All right. Well, question about determinism. That's above my pay grade, insofar as I have no effing clue how we define determinism and so on. And I want to try and steer clear as far as possible from that question. I really love the debate in metaphysics about universals and particulars and causation. Determinism and free will gives me, I get chills. And so that's the reason why I never became a metaphysician. And so, yeah, a question about determinism. I mean, it really depends upon how you specify what determinism is. And I'm just going to be a bit flat-footed there, just because it's really hard for me to wrap my mind. I can't even formulate an answer in terms of that question unless I have a clearer view of what determinism is. And so I think that would be something that I just need to think more about. I need someone to give me a definition of determinism, and then I need to think more about it. I think the second version of the question, can you put that last one up again? That gives me a better way to think about it.
One second. Oh, it's here.
No problem. Okay. I mean, it seems that the deer just acts according to its nature. It is by its nature that it looks for a better place to give birth. It doesn't have the capacity to choose by itself. Okay, good. Yeah. So, so this notion, there's two things here: choosing by itself and this according to its nature. And so, I mean, the way Aristotle defines choices prohairesis is, yes, strictly speaking, it's not a choice. Because choice belongs only to human rational animals. The choice is something we decide upon as a result of deliberation. Non-human animals can't deliberate in Aristotle, so they can't choose per se. But what I want to deny is, so for example, Hendrik Lorenz in his book denies them the ability to consider alternatives because they don't have the capacity for logos. And I think that that's just false. I don't think that that's right. You can consider alternatives. If I ask you, I can ask a mute person, well, it's complicated, whether they want an apple or an orange. I can show them a picture of an apple or an orange. They can look, without saying or, articulating logos, they can, select alternatives. They can envisage, okay, what's going to happen if I go down this road? What's going to happen if I go down the other road? And they can use that to inform how they behave. So in some sense of considering alternative courses of actions, I don't see any reason to deny that non-human animals can do that. They can't do it by saying A or B, but they can do it by picturing one course of action and then subsequently picturing another, and then selecting one that they think is best for them in the relevant circumstances. So I think that they can select, different potential means to a certain desired outcome. They can consider alternatives and select one that seems best to suit them. So in that sense of choice, I think that we can make sense of it it's a kind of weighing of alternatives. Now, in terms of the by nature, yeah, so good. There is a passage in Physics 2.8, many of you might know this, the teleology, where he actually uses the swallow's nest building as an example of something that's done by nature, as an illustration of the goal-orientedness in nature. And there, I mean, what does he mean by nature? So one way of parsing it, which doesn't seem sympathetic to my interpretation, is there's like an inborn program that is wholly causally responsible for this behavior, kind of in the way that digestion and so on is. It's not something that they have voluntary control over. It's just when they're in the right situation, they need a shelter and so on, boom, there's some program inside of them that moves their body in such a way that they go out and get straws and so on. So I think that if that's, I mean, it's hard to know in the physics, if you just had the Physics 2.8 passage, I mean, his reading of that, what he's doing there, using as an illustration of goal-orientedness in nature, that's perfectly fine. He can have that understanding of the by nature qualification there for his purposes. Other people I talked to about this wanted to use a more watered down notion of by nature, insofar as it's a result of a certain, capacity that they have by nature, that involves thought and desire and so on. So there's a question about what he means by desire, or sorry, by nature in that passage. And I mean, one thing that I'm perfectly amenable to is perhaps when he was working on the physics, he thought, he held a version of this view where everything was pre-programmed and they had very little in terms of cognition, and cognition played a very little role in what they were doing. However, if that's what he thought, it seemed that by the time he did all of his biological researches, and he became so impressed by the cognitive feats of animals and their behavior is just, I mean, this is what people nowadays tend to think. This is why they're not behaviorists anymore, is because sure, there are certain patterns of behavior, like the gray lag goose's egg rolling behavior, that can be explained as a kind of stimulus response in virtue of a kind of natural program that they exhibit, because it's not very nuanced. You can put them a baseball and they'll roll something that's kind of spherical and egg-shaped, but not an egg, and they'll do the same thing, stick out their neck and roll it. But there's other behavior where it's very nuanced, and they can make very fine-grained distinctions. And so a lot of people now think that that's based on a kind of learning, which requires kind of cognition and desire psychology. In short, so I think a lot of people now think that certain facets of animal behavior are so complex and dynamic that they can't be explained without the ascriptions of cognitive representations and desires. And I think at least by the time Aristotle got to the history of animals and so on, he was swimming up that stream. That's the view he endorsed. And so while there are some behavior that can be explained in the case of animals as a result of nature, there's others that need to have kind of psychological causes. Now, it's a further question, of course, to say whether those psychological causes can be described as episodes of thought or not. But for reasons, I'm very well that there's a jump there. But that's what I would say to that question about by nature. That's at least the beginnings of a response that I would give to that question.
Okay, so the first question was, the first observation was by Samara, which was about the nature of imagination. I'm not sure you tackled that. Okay. And its content, what do you think it's involved with imagination?
Okay, yeah, again, I was using just imagination because that's what I didn't say that, and I probably should have. I should just say, yeah, fantasia. Most people now call it imagination. there are other people who, use different terms, but they just, most people call it imagination just as a tag, in the way that they call IT on cause and so on, without necessarily intending to say anything about imagination. Again, I haven't done a very detailed study of the notion of imagination, and so my use of the term is just based on kind of terminological legislation for convenience. Now, the other question, though, that Daniel asked about its relation to perception is, well, again, I'm still learning about Fantasia, thinking through Fantasia. But what I will say is that the way he describes it in 3.3, he only gives a couple descriptions of it, things that look to be like quasi-definitions or the closest things to definitions. And if you put all those passages together, like I think Jessica Moss does a good job of, it looks like Fantasia are perceptual remnants. There is this deliberative Fantasia that he mentions in the De Anima, but he doesn't really tell us that much about it. And I'm still wrapping my mind around the remarks in the relevant context and so on. And I know people have different views about it, but for me, the safest bet, the one that's most textually grounded, is the idea that a Fantasia is, a residual percept or something like that, and so you can't have a Fantasia without perception. And I think that applies at the token level. Now we need to make a distinction between like simple Fantasiae and composite Fantasiae, right? Because maybe certain creatures, and again, I don't know if Aristotle thinks this about non-human animals, but you can have a dream of a bear, whatever, pink bear or something, and even though I've seen the color pink and I've seen a bear, I've never seen an actual pink bear. Your mind can put these representations together in a certain way. There's some kind of composition activity that at least certain creatures that have Fantasia seem to be capable of. And so at the level of, if you consider those Fantasiae, as we should, not every Fantasia necessarily has to have a perceptual counterpart, but at the level of like the atomic Fantasia and how we specify those, the ones that are used to build up these more composite ones, I think there need to have perceptual antecedents. But yeah, it's a complex issue, and I'm really haven't done enough work to, admittedly, on Fantasia. I'm still working through the biological stuff, the Nikeckean Ethics stuff, and the De Anima stuff. That's not related to the Fantasiae. And so, yeah. That's where I'm at so far.
Okay, thanks, Joe. Thank you very much for sticking with us. I understand you have a son to catch in school, and we all know there's a special place in Hades for those who keep little children waiting for the fathers, so I don't want to be there. Thank you, everybody, for coming. Thank you all for joining us for this wonderful talk. I hope I haven't disappointed many of you by not putting your questions up here, but I have taken note of all of them. I will send them to Joe later, and I'm sure he will find the time to answer you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye. We'll see you soon.
Thank you all. It was nice seeing you all. Stay safe.
Thank you.